أهلا وسهلا، أنا محمد تهامي، مؤسس شركة باشن بوينت، واحدة من الشركات الرائدة في تطوير ريادة الأعمال في مصر. ودي حلقة جديدة من The League of Business Legends اللي فيها بنستضيف أكبر خبراء ريادة الأعمال في العالم عشان ينشروا الأمل تاني في ريادة الأعمال ونساعد أكبر عدد ممكن إن هو يقدر يبدأ المشروع بتاعه بشكل سهل جدا وبمنتهى الأمان. النهارده معانا شخصية مهمة جدا جدا، هو باتريك McGinnis، مؤلف كتاب اسمه The 10% Entrepreneur. It's an international bestseller، وهو انفستور في شركات كتير قوي في امريكا ولاتين امريكا واسيا ويوروب، وعنده خبره كبيره جدا في رياده الاعمال وفلسفه خاصه اسمها The 10% Entrepreneur. في كتاب تاني هو هيطلقه قريبا هنتكلم عنه قريب برضه في الكول. فليت مي سويتش لباتريك ونرحب بيه. Patrick, welcome to the show. Thank you very much for being with me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Let's start with your backstory. How did you start your entrepreneurship quest?
Oh boy, it was not part of the plan. That's the most important thing.
Wow.
I am not naturally an entrepreneur. I didn't really know any entrepreneurs growing up. I come from a very small town where there are some entrepreneurial people, but people who own a shop or a store, but certainly not starting sort of startups or anything like that. And my parents didn't work in entrepreneurial ventures, so it was something that was seemed very risky and frightening to me, to be honest. And so I ended up working after college in investment banking in New York, so very much in the corporate world. And then I went on to get a degree at Harvard Business School and came out and worked at another large financial firm. And I had no plans of entrepreneurship. I had friends who'd gone on to become entrepreneurs, but I thought that they were, a bit crazy and very different than me. But then in 2008, during the financial crisis, my company, AIG, blew up. My stock fell 97%. And I realized that the world that I thought was so stable, which is the corporate world, wasn't stable at all. And in fact, that I needed to diversify myself. And so I decided to take more responsibility, take control, and find a way to integrate entrepreneurship into my life and my career in a way that was much more sustainable, which was by doing it part-time.
Wow, that's interesting. So was that the beginning of the 10% entrepreneur, or was this something that you developed over the years?
So this was the beginning of the 10% entrepreneur. Basically, I had a friend who was an entrepreneur at the time. He was working on a new company, and he said, "Why don't you come work with me on this part-time? I'll pay you a little bit of money. I'll give you a share of any of the sales you generate, and I'll give you some stock in the company, and you can work with me." And I thought to myself, "Oh, I've never heard of such an approach. And frankly, it doesn't sound as scary if it's not my full-time job. So why don't I work with him?" And I started working with him as what I call now an advisor. And then later I invested in a company that he started as an angel investor. And then I started finding other opportunities to invest or be an advisor or even a co-founder in businesses. And now today, it's about 8 years since I started. I've done more than 25 different projects. 2 of the companies I invested in went on to become companies that are worth more than $1 billion. A bunch of them have gone nowhere or failed. But in general, I built a portfolio of part-time entrepreneurial activities that have been really meaningful in terms of just changing the way I think about entrepreneurship and even giving me the courage to consider maybe going and doing a full-time venture for myself.
Wow. So what exactly is the 10% entrepreneur? What's the philosophy behind that? And why 10%? Why this number? Yeah.
Sure. 10% entrepreneur is really aimed at the person who has a full-time job and either just doesn't feel comfortable or cannot go do a full-time venture, but at the same time is interested in entrepreneurship. And so what I tell those people is start out small. Basically, try something part-time, and then potentially, if you enjoy it and if it goes well, spend more time. And the reason that I say 10%, actually, in the beginning, I thought perhaps it would be higher, maybe 20%. But then as I started doing it, I realized actually 10% is enough to get going. It's enough to do something, but not too much that you have to upset your entire life. So it's sustainable. And then I looked at a couple of interesting kind of figures that helped me to settle on 10%. One is the idea of in Christian religion, we have what's called a tithe. I believe in Muslim religion, it's like a zakat, right? Which is the idea that you give 10%. So it's enough to make a difference, but not too much that you can't actually do it. So that felt like an interesting number about commitment. And then finally, the average angel investor invests about 10% of their money into entrepreneurial ventures. So I thought that was another interesting data point about what is an appropriate level of risk to take on.
Oh, that's very interesting. At Passion Point, we teach people a 30-minute approach, like working 30 minutes every day on the passion business. And that will be more than enough to start something, as you are saying.
Very sensible, because you start with 30 minutes. It's kind of like meditation. When you start with meditation, you don't tell people meditate for an hour. You start with 5 minutes and then you increase over time. Or running, you don't run a marathon, you run a mile. If you start with 30 minutes and then you enjoy it and lose track of time and you realize, actually, I've just spent 40 minutes, great, and you can go from there.
But some people just perceive entrepreneurship as something that's very big to manage beside a job. And they think that how big of a company can I start with dedicating 10% of my time? There will be no way to make a full transition afterwards, because the company that I would start beside my job wouldn't necessarily provide me with the amount of paycheck that I'm getting now. And the profit will be minimal, even if it can work as a second income. But if I have a plan to grow and do this full time, then this size of business that I would start by 10% of my resources wouldn't be enough. So what would you say to that concern?
I think to begin with, we must start small, because we must experiment and test and learn what actually works before considering scaling up. And so I hear this a lot from people saying, oh, if I only give a little bit of time, that isn't enough to get going. To which I respond, no, because what you want to do is spend that time learning and refining, so that when you do have the decision to dedicate more time, you have the data to know what works and what does not, and then you can scale up appropriately. That's really critical, because then you will have the confidence to potentially go ahead and spend more time, and even at some point go full time. But of course, when you work with fewer hours and you invest less time into something, it's impossible to grow as quickly as if you had done it full time. But at the same time, your chances of completely failing and losing everything are basically zero. So I think of it as a risk mitigated way of exploring entrepreneurship. And to me, it's a much more sensible way of doing things. And in fact, I can't tell you how many entrepreneurs have come to me and said, oh, I wish I had done it your way, because I would have saved myself so much money, time, and pain had I just started out incrementally. But I convinced myself I had to go big or go home, as we say. And unfortunately, that can work. And there are examples of that working, but it is far harder.
So based on your experience, how long will it take to make the transition to a full-time entrepreneur? Because it took me 10 years. So I had a side project for like 10 years until I was confident enough to go full scale. And it was the best decision ever. And I even took it in Jan 2012 after the Egyptian revolution by 1 year. So it was a very hard time back then, but I was totally ready and confident to take this leap. But in your experience, how long usually it takes to go full scale, the snowball effect that you call it?
Yeah. So I think there is no sort of a data source that I can speak of where I've seen, a full data set and I can tell you where it is. I can tell you anecdotally what I see, which is that the average person, if we were to think about the potential outcomes, outcome number one is you try something full time and then it doesn't work or you don't like it and you stop, right? And so that's a decent amount of people. Option number two is you try something, it becomes very successful within a year or two, and then you go full time. Option number three is kind of a middle ground where you work on something, but maybe it remains a side project for a very long time, for 5 to 10 years or potentially forever. And so because you like it, but you're not it's not what you want to do full time. You're not interested in being an entrepreneur, because being an entrepreneur, as we all know, it's not easy, right? And it has stress and uncertainty, and especially in a time like now where, we're all living through the global pandemic. If you had quit your job to open a restaurant and now you can't even operate it, obviously, like, that's a nightmare. And so stability for some people is incredibly important. I certainly respect that. But I would say, in general, what I found is the decision to go full-time is a factor of two things. Number one, it's their ability to generate an income. And number two, it's the ability to believe that this business is going to be able to scale. And if you get to a point where you can't handle it anymore, where you're saying to yourself, oh my goodness, there's not enough hours in the day, but I still want to do this, then either you need to hire somebody or bring in a business partner. If you're not willing to leave your job, and there's all things you can do all of those things. And so I think it's just important to remain flexible in all of the, in learning and looking at the data at all times to make the smartest decisions you can.
That's very good. And I like the approach or the angle of learning, that you need first to learn and test and fail and try until it works, or you reach the optimum business model before you go and do this full time. So consider it as like a school where you learn entrepreneurship step by step. And there is an interesting thing in your book that you mentioned that your entrepreneurial venture beside your job can make you actually better at your current job. How is that?
Yes. This is super important. And one of the things that I learned as I promoted this book and traveled with it, and at this point I've had the chance the book is out in like 12 languages, including Arabic, by the way. And wow. I've spoken at companies all over the world. For example, I spoke in Jordan at Zain Telecom about this concept because they were interested in this. So it's something that we see across the world. I think it's important that as everybody who's listening, and many of you are in the Middle East, remember that and that this is not a American concept. Like the idea of the 10% entrepreneur isn't something that you have to live in New York City or London to do. It really is relevant. And having spent time in places like Al-Karak in Jordan, meeting with entrepreneurs, I know that it's possible to do it in all of these places. And so I do want to make that very clear. Now, in terms of the corporate setting, listen, corporations, we love them. They give us jobs and they provide very valuable services into our economies and our lives. But many organizations do not know how to be entrepreneurial. They've gotten too big. And in fact, their employees have never worked in an entrepreneurial organization and therefore haven't learned how to be entrepreneurial. Even Google, where I've given a bunch of speeches, we love Google. Google it's no longer a startup, and many of the people who work there have never been entrepreneurs. So as a result, it's important for us to realize that companies actually, if they're quite intelligent, will empower their employees to take charge of their own education as an entrepreneur and then bring what they learn back and share it with the organization. It's like anything else. If you empower your employees to go out and learn something, and then you give them a form in which they can invest that back into your company, you're far better off. Now, companies could say, and they do say sometimes, well, yes, all of that is true, but what if the person leaves and starts their own company? Well, guess what? They were going to do it anyway. So much better to recognize the reality of the situation, that many people are doing this, and empower people and try to get the most out of them rather than make decisions based on fear, which is what happens when you do that.
Yeah. So do you have like an interesting, inspiring story that you usually mention or highlight in your talks that really reflects the true meaning of 10% entrepreneur?
Yes, I have two. I want to give you my stories from the Middle East today. Okay. I'm going to give you two. One is from Egypt and one is from Jordan. So in Egypt, there is a wonderful company called Al Munir Eye Hospital. And the founders are Rana and Nora, and they are amazing women. And basically, they both started this part-time. One was a doctor in an eye hospital. This is dealing with people with diabetes who lose their sight. It's a big problem, as we all know, in Egypt. She was working as a doctor. The other co-founder had worked in sort of the computer world in information technology, and they were just friends. They're neighbors in West Cairo, and they would chat over and over again about this idea of, oh, wouldn't it be great if we could open up specialized eye hospitals? And so that's what they did. Both of them part-time collaborated to open their first hospital. That has gone on to grow. They have now hospitals throughout the Cairo metropolitan area. They're endeavor entrepreneurs, so they've been recognized for their acumen. But again, the one was working as sort of part-time and staying home, and the other was working as a doctor and on the side doing this. And they were able to experiment, find the right mix before going full-time. So that's a great example. Another is a story about a guy named Zaid Huzban, who is based in Amman. And he basically was like a DJ and also had a day job, but then started a business on the side with a business partner who actually stayed in his job. And so Zaid ended up going full time. The business partner stayed in his job, and they helped each other out financially so that they could basically be able to start this business, and they shared money and things like that. They started the first food delivery company in Jordan, which they then basically sold. And then as they kind of sold it and transitioned and were working as employees now of a larger company, started a new company called POS Rocket, which now has gone on to raise millions of dollars. And they're also, Zaid is also an endeavor entrepreneur. But he was a great example of somebody who's already an entrepreneur, actually has this company, sells it, and then giving everything he's learned, starts a new company based on that while employed for a new company that has acquired his business. And so he's what I call 110% entrepreneur, because he's a full-time entrepreneur, and then on the side he's doing his 10%. And so it's a really wonderful way. Both of those stories, what I think is great about them is you see people who were able to use their day jobs as a way to learn, but also as a sense of stability so they could try something riskier on the side.
That's a good one. Wow. So having a stable job can empower you to risk disruptive ideas.
Yes.
Wow. That's amazing.
Think about the founders of Apple, right? Like they were working at HP. And so we always hear we love these stories of a garage, right? And it's always about the garage. The garage is the fiction part of the story. The real story is the cubicle at the big company where they go every day and work.
Yeah. Interesting. So you teach in your book a step-by-step plan that takes someone, typically an employee, to identify the project that he is about to start or wants to start or passionate about starting. And then the most interesting part is finding smart ways to commit the minimum amount of resources to actually kickstart that project. So would you share with us this step-by-step plan in brief?
Yes. So basically, when you're a 10% entrepreneur, what you need to do is come up with a plan. And there are really three parts to the plan. The first part is determining your resources. So what are the resources you have available to invest into what you're doing? The second is figuring out a process to determine whether a project is a good project to do or not. And the third is figuring out how to leverage your network in order to make your work easier, because you can't sort of do these things alone. You need help, like anything else in life. And so basically, the first one's investing your resources. So you've got to figure out how much time, money you have, and there's a process to do that that's in the book, and you can find it on my website as well. But for example, if you have very little time on your hands, being a full-time founder, trying to start a new company is harder than, for example, being an investor, because investing you don't have to operate it, right? If you got tons of time but no money, you couldn't be an investor, but you could start a company. And so you've got to think about how your resources map to your opportunities. And then, of course, the most important resource that you have to invest is your knowledge. And so I talk about you only want to do projects that are the combination of what you understand and what you like to do. Because what you understand will help you to be successful, and what you like to do will continue to work when you'd rather be outside, hanging out at the beach or something. And then that's part one. Part two is figuring out what projects to actually sort of engage in. And that's a process of due diligence, thinking carefully about whether the idea makes sense. And it's really driven by your own knowledge. So again, it's an opportunity to figure out, do you have the requisite knowledge to be successful? And finally is leveraging your network. And that's the idea that, all the people around you are going to help you come up with great ideas, find great ideas, figure out if they make sense, and then help them to grow. And so I have a whole plan for how you can figure that out.
Awesome. That's great. And I totally recommend your book for our listeners. It's an amazing one. And two things to close with: your FOMO and your FOBO. You know, two
Yes.
amazing terms that you coined. The first one is cool, but the second one is super amazing, at least for me, the FOBO one, because this one is really unique, and no one, I've never seen anyone who really could put a name to that type of fear, because it's a very special type of fear. FOMO is the fear of missing out, and I believe this is the title of your upcoming book. And yeah.
Yes.
I love it. So you are teaching people how to make better decisions, and now we are in a time of a great need to make better decisions, fast decisions, and right decisions, because in a crisis, usually people feel stuck, and they don't know where to go. So based on your FOMO approach, how can a company, a small business, make faster decisions? Maybe they pivot, they change the business model, their offers, so that they can navigate the crisis without any loss or minimum
Yes.
loss.
Yes. So I think these concepts are super important, and I would say at this point, as you mentioned, FOMO and FOBO. FOMO is famous. It's in the dictionary, of course. FOBO is not famous, or it's not as famous. It's getting a little more famous, and it's very relevant to any crisis time, because when we're in a crisis, our inclination is to make no decisions at all. And in fact, FOBO is about two things. It's about, number one, waiting for something better to come along than what you have today. And so
So FOBO is fear of better option.
Correct. Fear of a better option. So say you're trying to make a decision, you're like, well, I'm going to wait and see what happens. Let me see what happens. Now, why is that? It's because, number one, we want to maximize. We want the absolute best outcome possible. And number two is we want to hold our options as open for as long as possible and delay deciding. The problem with that, as we all know, is that if you try to do those things, you will wait too long, and you will get to a point where potentially you have no options at all. And you see that right now in the crisis that we're living with, the global pandemic, is the people who didn't act swiftly end up in a very bad place. And so that is why it's so important to identify this decision making. And what I recommend to people, and we could talk about this for hours and hours, but let me give you a couple of really quick points. Is number one, waste no time on small decisions. So literally anything, there's so many decisions we make every day that really don't matter. Little things like, am I having chicken or am I having fish? People could spend 10 minutes on that sometimes. We get stuck. And so you must absolutely spend zero time on that. And the way that I do that is I literally say to myself, okay, chicken or fish? Chicken is odd. Fish is even. Look down at my watch. It's 1:32 in the afternoon. That's even. I'll be having the fish. There you go. So I literally outsource.
Wow.
When it comes, and I do that many times a day, because it just helps me get through and make decisions quickly. And that leaves me the time and the energy for much more important decisions. And I did this TED Talk, which is about decision making, which I explain how to do this. So it's really worth checking out. It's called How to Make Faster Decisions. But basically, the critical thing to keep in mind is when people struggle to make important decisions, it's because it's not the maximization. It's not that we want the best. It's the process of going back to things without eliminating them. So the critical thing you must do is eliminate options that are not, you sort of try to choose the best one, compare them one by one, eliminate the one that is not as good, and then you must eliminate that permanently, because that's where we get stuck. We do not want to mourn the option that we couldn't take, because we want to have everything for ourselves, and that's where you get stuck. So I explain I have a whole sort of process around that it would take me too long to explain here, but you can either check it out in the TED Talk or in the book. And I've been using it. For example, I used it to decide whether I would be quarantined in New York City or if I would go somewhere else, and I chose to be here, and I'm glad I did that. So listen, I will never know what the other thing could have been, but I made the decision consciously and mindfully.
Yeah, we see the fear of a better option in deciding which project should you start, because we basically advise people to start a passion-based business, something that you are truly passionate about. And sometimes, or very often, you see a person who is passionate about a lot of things, and they call themselves multi-passionates. And they love this identity so much, but they don't realize that being stuck in choosing the right field to start a business in will cost you a lot. And they are afraid, what if I pursue that passion and that was the right one for me now, and that passion is just a hobby and I will not be interested in it in the long term? Maybe this could be a better option. This passion could be a better option. Can I mix two passions and start a business in a mix of different industries, and so on and so on? And so it's a negative loop that they keep on. And this is basically the term that you brilliantly called fear of a better option. So do you have a specific advice for that, choosing the field or to start a business in, especially if I have passion for many?
I think what's really critical in that instinct is, I agree with the passion bit for sure, but I really think it's important to match that with some sort of experience and expertise, because enjoying something is important, but it's not sufficient. And so, I see so many people, actually friends or people that I've met through, the stuff that I do, that say, tell me what they do for a living, what company they started. And I said, well, why did you do that? And they said, well, I just love that space. Okay, but had you worked in that before? No, I just really loved it. And I think that's important, but if you don't know anything about a particular industry, you're far more likely to make the basic mistakes that you should not make. And so I always encourage people, find something you love, but also something that you've done before or have experience and you're good at, because then that combination is powerful.
This is brilliant, because in our methodology at Passion Point, we spend a lot of time in digging deep in the field you are passionate about. This is different than other entrepreneurial programs where you are asked to take your business idea and do a business plan and then go implement. We don't do a business plan until we gain practical knowledge about the field or the industry that you are about to start a business in. And like you said, to build a network, to study and to learn, and to maybe share some ideas on social media and publish some ideas to the world and see the feedback of the audience and so on, asking your potential customers, and a lot of in the field work before you even sit and put your business plan. So I totally resonate with what you are saying. So time flies by so quickly, and I would love to leave our audience with your number one advice for entrepreneurial success.
Don't be afraid to ask for help from mentors, but also from everybody in your community. I think whether it's asking somebody to try your project or try your product, or it's asking somebody who's very experienced in your sector to be an advisor, do not be shy. I always struggle with that. I've had to learn that the hard way, but having people around you who are experienced is an incredible, incredible gift.
Wow. That's gold. Thank you very much, Patrick, for your time. That has been so valuable and helpful. And I wish you all the best. And I highly recommend again for people to check your 10% Entrepreneur and your book, FOMO. Amazing stuff. And I hope to meet you soon again in Cairo.
Inshallah.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.